get started here today. Kelly, can you see my screen? Everything good to go there? All right, very good. Well, welcome everybody and good afternoon. I hope you are all staying very cool wherever you are, because I know here in Pennsylvania we are melting. So, and I'm sure you're probably all from Pennsylvania, but anyway, thank you for joining us today on our session here today. And I just want to go over a few housekeeping before we move forward with our presentation today. So if you could keep yourself muted, unless at some point Kelly and I need to ask you to unmute, as we maybe get to the question answer period at the end, things like that. In the meantime, feel free to use the chat to make any type of comments or questions. And as Kelly and I go through, we may be able to respond to some of those comments or questions during the presentation, but if not, we will most definitely get to them at the end of our presentation as well, because we are going to allot 10 to 15 minutes at the end of our session where we will actually shut off the recording and we will be able to answer some of the questions that you may have after we're done today. And as you do ask your questions, if there are some personal details that you have, we would ask you that you refrain from some of those personal details, because at the PEAL Center you can always talk with us on a one-on-one basis as well, and we might be able to help you further that way instead. And then please let us know if there's anything that we can help you with, like turning on your closed captioning. Please let us know that as soon as possible so that we can be sure to accommodate everyone today. Okay. Sorry about that. I should be in my presentation mode. There we go. Okay. All right. So just so you know where you are today, and I hope you are in the right place, you're here with the PEAL Center, and we are riding the wave or catching the wave with all of several different sessions that we're holding this summer. And so today, the wave that you caught is Section 504 Basics, Understanding 504 Plans in Schools. So let me tell you a little bit about the PEAL Center for those of you who may not be familiar with us. Our mission at the PEAL Center is to educate and empower families to ensure that children, youth, and young adults with disabilities and special healthcare needs lead rich, active lives as full members of their schools and communities. And that is our mission at the PEAL Center. And how we do that is, in my particular role at the PEAL Center, by the way, I'm Diane Perry. I am a family resource specialist at the PEAL Center. And the work that I do is supported by a grant that's called the PTI, the Parent Training and Information Center. It is a federal grant through the Office of Special Education Programs. And it's a federal grant because we are federally funded in IDEA. We are mandated in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which means that our program is also federally funded. So all the services that we offer to families at the PEAL Center is at no cost, which is wonderful. Now, we have other programs that we do as well. And my colleague, wonderful colleague here today that I'm presenting with, Kelly, is going to introduce herself and what her role is at the PEAL Center.
So thank you, Diane. I am Kelly King. First of all, I'm a parent of two young men with different abilities, and I am the Family to Family Health Information Center Coordinator. And as Diane mentioned, our educational funding comes through federal funds. Similarly, the ability to help with healthcare issues for that same population. So the children, youth, and young adults with disabilities and special healthcare needs up to age 26, that funding for help with healthcare issues comes through, it's funneled through the Maternal and Child Health Bureau through our national office called Family Voices. And so when I'm talking about helping individuals with healthcare needs, when they have a disability, everything is healthcare. So if you have a question about anything related to healthcare, so funding, relationships in your community, the medical issues themselves, and while we can't answer those questions, we can help you think through those, the transition to adulthood. So lots of different things that we deal with. But basically, if you're living and breathing and have a disability, everything's healthcare. And I am a white woman with long dark hair. And as I said, I'm the parent, and I've been doing this work here with the PEAL Center for over a decade. So delighted to join you today to talk about 504s.
Thanks, Kelly. And I just want to let everyone know too that I am a white woman with colored blonde hair, which actually has some darker roots as well, but I am wearing glasses as well, and a white and tan colored type of a shirt that has stripes on it. And I'm in my office, so you'll see some of my office attire behind me, like my door that has my wonderful poster that says, welcome to all. So, and I also wear the hat of a parent of a young man, of 2 children. But the one who brings me to this world mainly is my younger son, David. And he does give me permission to talk about him. And he experiences a disability as well, but he's a young adult at 29 at this point. So, so I'm so grateful that I was a very young mother, and I'm just a few years older than him. So let's get started. All right, our objectives today is to we're going to help explain what the purpose of Section 504 and Chapter 15, which is the chapter through the Pennsylvania Board of Education regulations. And that's where it describes how Section 504 should be implemented. We're going to compare the differences between IEPs, which is an individualized education plan, and Section 504. And we're going to try to share some of the differences of the purpose of each one and how the process is about as well. So we'll get into that a little bit later as well. And we're also going to describe how children can be eligible. So we'll go through that evaluation process. How are you eligible for Section 504 for the accommodations that can be afforded to you due to what may come out of that evaluation, and the steps that families might need to take to acquire in getting those accommodations. So to get us started, I'm going to start with what is Section 504, right? So Section 504 is of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and it is a civil rights law. Okay, and we're going to unpack some of this. So we're going to give you some broad stuff, but then we're going to get into the various details of the law itself and what all that means. Now, Chapter 15 is of the Pennsylvania Board of Education regulations, and that is where, you know, when you have IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, in Pennsylvania, there's Chapter 14, which gets into the regulations of what happens in Pennsylvania. But under the 504, in the Board of Education regulations, it's Chapter 15. And that's where it actually describes, those 2 chapters describe schools' responsibilities in implementation of, for this one in particular, the 504. And again, we're going to unpack some of that here. You know, this next screen really has a lot of the legal language. And it's important to that we put that legal language on the screen for you to see, because it's, you know, it's important that sometimes we really need to know what exactly does the law say. Okay, and Kelly and I are going to get into trying to unpack more as to, well, what does all that jargon mean? Because for me, it is jargon sometimes. When I read a law, I'm going to have to read it a few times, and then ask people, what does that really mean? And how does that, what happens to this or that? So that's really what we're going to be able to hopefully do for you today, and helping you understand all that. But basically, the 504 means that a child cannot be excluded because of their disability, nor should they be discriminated against. So generally, that's what the law says within all of this wording. So that's where we're going to be able to hopefully help you understand a little bit more about the guidance and what all does that really mean? What does disability mean? Do I really qualify? You know, all of that. So hopefully we'll be able to unpack some of that for you. I know I probably said that word a few times, but that's what we're going to do. Okay. So Section 504 eligibility occurs because the student may not require what's called the specially designed instruction. So, you know, here's the beginning of some of the differences between the IEP that you get when you have an eligibility under IDEA. And IEP, I did say earlier, was the individualized education plan. So, you know, when you do have that IEP, you qualify under IDEA because you have that IDEA disability. There's 13 categories of disability, but you also, because of that disability, require some type of specially designed instruction or special education. So there's a two-pronged qualification there for that. For the 504, it's really just specific to the disability. It's a physical or a mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And we're going to get into more detail about what does substantially limit mean? What is a major life activity? So we're going to get into and give you really some examples around that and to really help you understand that. Section 504 really requires school districts to provide what's called that free, appropriate public education, okay? And that's why we have that bolded there, because that is important to know that is what is required by schools to provide that, okay? So what I would like to start off here is now I just learned how to do this hopefully the right way so I can stay within my screens here. I want to actually go to this document. This is a side-by-side comparison of IEPs and 504s, and it is available on the website called understood.org. Now, hopefully, all right, I got the thumbs up. Kelly gave me the thumbs up. So I went to their website. Now, this link, if you are here, or even if you registered for our session today, you will get all the handouts and our PowerPoint. So these links will be live for you. So you'll be able to go to, because we're going to be giving you a whole bunch of resources later too. But this particular one is the difference between IEPs and 504s. And it's on the website understood.org. And they actually give you a whole host of wonderful. So once you're on this website, you might want to explore more if you really need to. But we really like this particular side by side because it really goes through, you know, a basic description of what is an IEP, what is a 504 plan, and then it gets into what it does. Okay, and it gives you that side by side comparison specific to those two documents. Okay, it also gets into what the law applies to, which laws is it under, which I kind of gave you that already in the beginning of this presentation. And then it does get into who's eligible, where Kelly and I are going to get into some of that in the rest of our slides as well. But as you can see, it is a really nice side by side to tell you exactly, you know, what happens with that evaluation, who creates it, what's in it. So this is a good resource for you, even after we are done our presentation. Then that way, you know, you have more resources than just our PowerPoint and what we're sharing with you. Okay, now, if I go back to this and I go to current slide, am I good? All right. See, I learned we get on early so we can get all the technology things out of the way. So, and I learned a new tricks and it worked for me. So I'm glad it did. So you can always teach somebody new things. Okay. So Kelly, I believe you're going to take off from here.
Indeed, I am. Thank you, Diane. And that chart again, I would strongly suggest that you take a look at that and then, really absorb that, because, sometimes people switch from 504 to an IEP because our needs change, and we want to do what's most impactful for our students. So that's a consideration. Sometimes it's great that students are making such progress. They no longer need specially designed instruction, but maybe the 504 is still something that's appropriate for them. So how is a student eligible? And so what happens is that an evaluation is done, and that evaluation is going to make a determination by looking and determining if indeed the student has a disability. But there's some nuances to that. And the disability, as Diane mentioned before, has to substantially limit one or more major life activities, which we still have under our hat here to show you in a moment. But you could also have a history of having such a disability, or be believe that you have a disability. So imagine a situation where your child has, say, an asthma diagnosis, and they haven't had any problems for some time. Maybe they play soccer in the summer, and on these hot days when there's a high pollen count or something, they have an issue. But perhaps that hasn't been impacting them in school, and you consider, well, do we need this 504 or not? Well, they have a history of having a disability, or maybe you move from school to school and they don't really know your child. So when you come into the school, they've got a history of having a disability, or they had an IEP, so that did in fact identify that they had a disability, and then they're no longer eligible because they don't need specially designed instruction. That individual has a history of having had a disability, so a 504 might be really appropriate for them. So if in fact you believe your child is eligible, you can go ahead and ask that this evaluation happen. Who's part of that evaluation? Well, there's a team of people that help in that process to determine if the student would need a 504 plan. But when we talk about eligibility, again, there are some other nuances. So your child may in fact have a disability, or one of these types that substantially limits a major life activity, but they might not be offered the 504 service agreement because the accommodations that they would need may be standard things that every student is allowed to have. So they may not actually get a plan as a consequence of those accommodations being available to everybody. And so what is a physical or mental impairment? So it can be pretty much anything. So you see physiological, mental, emotional, neurological, psychological, whatever the diagnosis from a licensed practitioner of the medical arts may be, could be a physical or mental impairment. And there are some hidden and invisible types of things that may not be obvious to your school district, but they have a responsibility, which we're going to talk about in a bit, to identify students who may have physical and mental impairments. And then it may be appropriate for them to refer the student for consideration of a 504 plan. So what are we talking about? Some individuals have intellectual disabilities, some have anxiety, some have schizophrenia, bipolar. There's been a considerable increase in mental health conditions as a consequence of COVID and that social isolation. There are certainly specific learning disabilities, and while those could be covered under an IEP, maybe that's not the most appropriate tool. Again, the clincher that Diane mentioned earlier is, do they meet that, what we call second prong? Do they require specially designed instruction as a consequence of that disability? And then they certainly can affect one body system or more than one body system. But even if it only affects one body system, that still could qualify them. Go ahead, please.
just going to add too that, and you may get to this too, Kelly, but I just wanted to kind of put out there that you may need that documentation from your doctor specifically too, like if it's what exactly does it affect as part of your body, and or how does it really affect the student in that in school, for them to access their education. So just wanted to make sure that the audience is aware that it will probably need some type of documentation from a doctor.
Yeah, absolutely. That's likely the first thing that the school is going to ask for if your student is referred for either an IEP or a 504, because they want to know what that background is. What is that diagnosis from the licensed practitioner of the medical arts? So that's, doctor, but other people could fit that criteria. So we told you we were going to unpack substantial limitation. And, honestly, that's pretty much determined by the team that's involved in the evaluation. So that's done individually on a case-by-case basis. And the laws that Diane cited for you earlier do not specifically define what that means. So how does that impact the child in school? That team's going to look at it through their perspective and determine if that substantially limits their involvement in the educational environment in any way, shape, or form. And again, through that evaluation process, which you as the family should be a part of, the teachers of the students, so I'd say the primary teachers who are involved, it's not always a teacher. There could be a student who participates in band and has some issue as a consequence of that. So it may be a band director, or maybe the student is diabetic and they participate in football or basketball. So that coach or some of the key staff that are involved with that sport may be the appropriate people to be involved. And so, it's not strictly a teacher. And if the student has perhaps allergies that they can't be exposed, let's say to peanuts or peanut butter, it's going to be really important that the cafeteria staff are aware of that, and that you're informed about the ingredients in various things that the student might be exposed to in the cafeteria. So they might be involved. So, it doesn't have to strictly be the teachers. Then, of course, medical professionals, which aren't always available, are not always able to come to the meeting, but by virtue of the fact that they could present some information. And at times I have participated in meetings where medical professionals have, scheduled to attend. So that can happen. And then, anybody else that knows the student well. So if you have individuals you want to invite, you're certainly welcome to do that. And during this consideration, the impairment, as I said, only needs to limit one major activity. It doesn't have to affect the child holistically with, 3 or 6 different things. As long as one major life activity is impacted, then that can be considered a disability. And as I said, the substantial limitation clause is really important, because if that's not found to be the case, then in fact the student isn't eligible for a 504. And Diane's going to talk to us a little bit about what do we do in the case of the school not wanting to provide us a 504 plan if they find the student isn't eligible, because that's definitely different from them not qualifying for special education. So I told you I was going to dig a little deeper into what those major life activities are. And if you just look at this, wow, it's just about everything, as simple as, walking, talking, eating, and sleeping, those things that happen in school that are important for learning, the learning in and of itself. How are we going to learn if we're not thinking correctly, if we're not concentrating, if we have difficulties with reading and writing and communicating? And, in kindergarten, they're starting working on, some of their writing activities. And if you've got problems with fine motor coordination, you've got a problem. So, if you look at this list, it's not exhaustive, but it's pretty extensive. And as you see, it's practically anything that can, fall under this category. So don't hesitate because you don't think that, the issue that your child is experiencing might not qualify. Don't hesitate to refer them if you feel that they need some accommodations to access their instruction and their education. It's certainly worth a consideration because this list is very, very lengthy and very significant, but not exhaustive. So as I told you, I deal with individuals who have health issues, and there are many students who have chronic health conditions. As I mentioned, diabetes already. There's students with epilepsy. There's students with genetic conditions, like anything, something that's not going to go away. But we know as a consequence of that, those students very often experience a lot of absences. Maybe they've been out for a surgery. Maybe their illness itself causes them to miss a lot of school. We certainly had students who missed loads of school because of COVID, not just particularly having a diagnosis of COVID, but because of all the closures and quarantines and some exposure. And so they missed a lot of days. And, Marina says here, cancer. Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to limit my list. It's practically anything, though. Just something that's ongoing. And cancer is one of those diagnoses that, you may be in remission, but that doesn't mean, as I said, you have a history of having the disability. A 504 plan may in fact be appropriate for a student who has had a diagnosis of cancer and is in remission. So understand that having a 504, this is really important. That doesn't in any way limit you to having a 504 if in fact at some point in time that student needs specially designed instruction and is going to need some additional help. They could be evaluated in order to get special education services through that IEP. So don't feel just because your child has a 504, you can never get out of that rut. An evaluation for special education is always an option if that's necessary. And then I want you to be cautious. Sometimes schools tell us things and there are policies that are in place. And remember, a policy is a policy, but it's not the law. So often school districts will offer homebound instruction to students. Now, understand that homebound instruction is something that's provided to every student if necessary. So for some reason, so my brother broke his leg. I tell people this story all the time. And he wasn't able to get to the building. So the homebound instructor came to him. But he was a general education student. So he probably got, 2-3 hours of instruction a week. And that was fine for him because he could do most of the work himself. But that isn't necessarily the case with our students who have disabilities. They may need additional instruction. They may need something done differently. So if the school is telling you, you get this, and that's all we offer, and they're not willing to discuss that with you, you may want to question that, and you may need to have a conversation about actually your students' needs and how they align to that blanket policy. And then sometimes it's something like, well, boy, if you're out because you missed, a week because of this surgery, you have to make up all this missed work. Well, that can be, that's something that can be discussed with a 504 service agreement. If you're getting the key components of education, do we really need to do all the missed work? What's that really all about? So, dig a little deeper, ask questions to try to get to the bottom of some of these policies, but don't just necessarily accept what you hear as absolute truth that has to apply to your child. And then, for the most part, and this varies widely, there are school districts that give you 10 days before you have to have a medical excuse. There are some that give you 15 days. I help a lot of students and families who are facing truancy issues. And many times there is a consideration of a chronic health condition and that the student missed a lot of days because of their health. And it can be a real hardship to go back to a physician for a medical excuse every single time you need it. And some of the physicians want to see the child every single time. Many of them who see you because of a chronic health condition, that's not the case. But again, it can be a hardship for a family. So if they say this is the policy and there's no wiggle room on that, it may be worth having a conversation about that and considering doing something differently. I've worked with a lot of students who, as a consequence of their chronic health condition, have their, maybe a student with anxiety or school refusal. Those tardies are excused and they don't accumulate and develop. Some schools will have a number of tardies equal an absence. So, you can put in accommodations that address those things. And then I've had students who get alternate attendance plans as part of a 504 or an IEP. And that, this 10-day policy can be circumvented. So you're not having to get, additional documentation from your physician. So lots of things like that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be these three policies, but if they say, this is how we do it, it's worth questioning. Well, tell me more about that and why. And he or she or they, my child needs something different as a consequence of their condition. So open up those lines of conversation and see where that goes.
And I was just going to add, Kelly, that there was an example in the chat about a concussion. And concussions can be, Kelly and I have worked with several different families around concussion because that's a whole range right there. I mean, you can have a concussion and, the student might need some accommodations for a short period of time, but there are some other concussions that go on or maybe bring on other medical concerns or other medical conditions within that child sometimes, and it can grow. And earlier when Kelly was talking about how you might need to be evaluated for special education services, so you might start off with the 504, but if those conditions worsen, due to maybe a concussion, for example, you may qualify for more special education services. So there's a whole list, like we said, of various conditions and things out there. But that was a really good example, I thought, in the chat there, and wanted to bring that up.
And remember too that a concussion is kind of maybe a horse of a different color, because depending on what your healthcare provider says, that might be something that's resolved very shortly, and the school is naturally going to give you those accommodations anyhow. So that's kind of nuanced depending on what the healthcare provider says. Is that really going to continue, or is it something that very quickly 2 weeks of this accommodations, by the time you would get an evaluation, those accommodations would no longer be needed, perhaps. So what does a school have to do? A school has to, under something that's called child find, try to identify children, young people who have a disability so that they can provide the services that they need to that child. So whether the child is living in a foster care situation, if they go to a private school, schools are responsible to identify those students who are thought to have one of these impairments, and they should be then, offering an evaluation. Well, schools often put notice in the paper before school starts, and they have open lines of communication with private and parochial schools to try to help them to identify those students, but they don't always find them. So it may be you, the parent, who is the one going and asking for evaluation, and understand that anybody could refer a student for a 504 evaluation. Maybe your doctor would do that. Maybe somebody from the YMCA, I could refer your child for a 504 evaluation. Anybody can do that. And then once that is done, there's a time frame, and Diane will tell you a little bit about that. It's not a hard, solid time frame, but once they're found to be eligible through that evaluation process, and evaluations can look very different. They can do a comprehensive, full psychoeducational evaluation, or they can do that by just sitting around the table with you and kind of going through a process. Yes, they have a disability, and yes, it impacts a major life activity, and found eligible. Okay, so what do we need to do to help them to access their education? So they can do it in a very simple meeting with you, or it can be a very elaborate process. It differs. Once that happens, they should be developing a written plan to provide whatever those accommodations are that your child needs in order for them to have what Diane just described as the free, appropriate public education. And appropriate is one of those words too that isn't really strongly defined. Appropriate is what the child needs, and who decides that? It's the team that decides that. That too should happen in the least restrictive environment. And that means the place where the student can access what they need, hopefully with all of the kids that live in their neighborhood around them, in the local school building. And only when that's when they can't meet that child's needs in that classroom would they consider putting them in a different classroom or a different place, perhaps. If a student is in a private school or a parochial school, I just told you there's a child find obligation. Those schools, if they're receiving federal funding, as Diane mentioned previously, they too have to provide some services for the children that are being educated there. But those look more like the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act accommodations. They wouldn't be required to develop this full 504 plan. And in fact, you know, a written plan isn't absolutely identified in the law as I understand it, but it's certainly a best practice. You want to see that so that you can hold people to fulfilling that, and that everybody understands what accommodations your child needs in the situation that they're in. So as Diane mentioned, the Pennsylvania piece of legislation, the code that covers this piece of requirements is Chapter 15. And the 25 days has to do with when they have to respond to your request or somebody's request for the child to be evaluated for a 504. But there's not a specific time frame to do the actual evaluation. It's supposed to be done in a reasonable period of time. So if it's going on for months and your child isn't getting the accommodations they need, you know, shoot another email or give them a call and say, did somebody drop the ball here? This seems to be dragging out a bit. And I had hoped we could get this done sooner. You know, maybe somebody just dropped the ball on something, but they're usually pretty good about that. Those are done in short order. And generally I see them done well before the 25-day responses. They actually call everybody together and do the evaluation and get that in place. So I'm not seeing a lot of problems with that, but you need to understand, you know, what your rights are here. And they do not say in the regulations that a report has to be issued. And I rarely see those. Again, when a pretty comprehensive evaluation report is done, I would see that being shared with the parent. But those checklists that they do at school, you don't generally see those. If you would like a copy of that, don't hesitate to ask for that, because that would be going into your child's educational files. So it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a copy of that to keep with your records. But it's not a report per se. It may just be a form where they're completing the various pieces and, you know, checking some boxes. And then unlike an IEP where reevaluations have to happen 2 years if the child has an intellectual disability, or 3 years generally, unless that is waived in writing, these evaluations for a 504 have to happen periodically. So if you know that something significant is changing, maybe the child's moving from elementary to a middle school or middle school to high school, those would be great times to ask if that could happen, or if there are any other things that need to be reconsidered. But otherwise, those don't happen very frequently in my experience. Only when there's some need to look at something that may be different.
Yeah, and I'm just going to do a time check, Kelly, because we had a question in the chat box about placement. And it was actually coming from our Facebook Live, I'm unclear on it, but I want to give time at the end of the presentation to be able to answer some of these questions. And we got a few more slides that we need to finish up here. So just wanted to do the time check.
So as I indicated, the evaluation can be started by either the parent or the school, and anybody else could refer somebody for an evaluation. Simply ask for that in writing. It's always a good idea to ask for things in writing, so when those 25 days are up, you've got some documentation in there. And then before that can get started, the school has to get your signature and your permission to get that that evaluation initiated. And then if you have medical documentation, the school will be asking for that. If you don't have it, you might want to schedule an appointment with the physician or ask them to get records or write a letter documenting the disability and how that impacts the student's situation in any major life activity that could have implications for the school day. Know, however, that just because you have a diagnosis, that in and of itself is not an evaluation. This evaluation would be done by the school team under their under the way that they have established to get that completed. So just handing them that doesn't mean you're going to get the 504, just for clarity.
Okay, great. And so FAPE, the free appropriate public education, when you're under the section 504. These accommodations should be provided in the general education classrooms or any other of those classrooms that a child goes through, a student goes through, art gym, any of those. It can also provide accommodations in extracurricular activities, as Kelly noted earlier, like if you're involved in band or a particular sport or something like that. Those accommodations should be given in those settings as well. Even field trips, like for example, if your child might need some type of medication or some other type of accommodation, depending on the field trip and where you're going, things like that. So it really is to meet that individual child's needs. What are those needs? How is it specific to that child? And and I'm not sure if this kind of falls in where we had the question about actual placement. 504 is accommodation. So you're really accommodating, you're writing these accommodations on this plan to assist the child, just assist that student in whatever setting they're in, which most of the time is a general education type of a setting or the special things like that. Are there times when they might be in some type of specialized classroom or things like that? Maybe, but the majority of that is really of the accommodations are in just your regular settings, your typical settings. So just wanted to and I'm not sure if that kind of answered that question or not, but I just wanted to throw that out there as well. I also just wanted to note too, that if a child is provided an IEP, the Individualized Education Plan, under IDEA, the 504 requirement's already met. You're already, when you're doing an IEP, you're writing accommodations and modifications, right? So you're already, and 504 is just the accommodations. You're already doing that in an IEP. There's really no need to have both plans because that IEP would encompass everything. So one of the other things that is provided within the law is that the school districts must have procedural safeguards. Now, these are different from what you might be expecting if you have an IEP and you get the procedural safeguards. These are procedural safeguards the school district must provide to you but a lot of times it's a lot shorter. But what it does need to have is they need to give you a notice. They need to give you a notice of what your procedural safeguards can be. They need to give you a right to review records. They need to give you that procedure. How do you do that? How am I going to review these records? They have to give you a right to disagree. And then a lot of times, what are those dispute resolution options if you do disagree? So it could be an informal conference with the school district. It could be some type of due process hearing that you get through the Office of Dispute Resolution. And that's a great website to go to and to give you more information, ODR, Office of Dispute Resolution. You could also even do an administrative complaint for the Office of Civil Rights or the Bureau of Special Education. And, lastly, if you would really need to, a lawsuit. So there are various options for you to, if you don't agree with the process or anything that the school district is saying or not saying, or if you want a particular accommodation, like if there's some type of disagreement. So you do have procedural safeguards. Be sure that if you don't get them, you ask for them because you should be given those procedural safeguards. So once and Kelly touched on this a little bit earlier about that actual service agreement. So once you go through that evaluation, the child, yes, we do need to, write in some type of accommodations. So Chapter 15, again, specific to Pennsylvania, requires that this agreement be written for and in the law, and that's why we have it in quotes. It still says protected handicapped student. That was the language that they used, years ago. So that is why we have that in quotes. But this service agreement should outline all the accommodations that have been agreed upon between the school and the parent. And sometimes it can go back and forth. I've assisted some parents where, they sat at their meetings, they have things written, they send the plan, and the parent's like, well, I thought it would be written this way, or I thought we were going to add that. And then you just like, okay, I thought we were going to add this. Oh, yeah, we did. So that, so it might be a conversation, right? Again, Kelly talked about it being reviewed annually to ensure that it's current. So it must be reviewed annually. Be sure that it's shared with, it also needs to be shared with all school personnel that works with the student. And we say school personnel because, again, it could be the cafeteria personnel. It could be coaches in some type of, activity, sports activity. And it can be amended if and when needed. Again, Kelly spoke about if the student's medical condition changes one way or another, then yes, you're going to be able to meet and you're going to need to amend that. And again, parent involvement in any of this, anytime there's anything that has to do with your child, the parent involvement is imperative. LEA, the school district, requires parental consent prior to actually providing services. So if it's your first 504 service agreement, you need to give permission. Otherwise, these accommodations are not going to happen. Parental notification is required if there's a change also in that service agreement. Or, if there's any accommodations that need to change. Again, that child's condition could get worse, could get better, and you may need to make some of these necessary changes. But any substantial change in placement requires an evaluation. So let's say the condition is getting, where the child, these accommodations just aren't working. This 504 service agreement just might not be working. You may say, we really need a full psychological educational evaluation. And that type of evaluation will need that parental consent. Okay, and you'll go through that process that IDEA and Chapter 14 has laid out for us. But again, just because you have a 504 and it might not be working, and maybe you feel the child might need more, you can request that full evaluation be done to see if they qualify for something more.
There's a little bit of conversation going on in the chat, Diane, with regard to 504s and IEPs and having both of them. And the pieces of a 504, when you would switch over to an IEP, let's say, would be incorporated into the IEP. I've only seen both documents when the student has a gifted IEP, and they really could still be merged together. having multiple documents is really confusing, and then who's responsible for what. So those are generally folded in together, and it would be extremely rare that anybody would have both. And if they were trying to have you have both, I'd be asking the question about why do we have two different documents? I understood that once my child has an IEP, those 504 accommodations should be in there, because we know that specially designed instruction includes both accommodations and that specially designed instruction that are really solidly outlined. So they should all be in there. So ask why if that's happening. Remember that this too, the 504 service agreement is indeed a legal document. And so the students should be getting the things that are listed on there. So you can imagine multiple documents, people trying to implement this from here and this from there. That certainly would eliminate a lot of confusion. And so everybody that services the child in the school setting should have a copy of that, because how are you going to follow something that you don't have and you don't know about? But it's not a bad idea to double check that everybody has the copy, because, you know, I've seen it happen all too often. Somebody didn't even know that the child had a disability. And there are some obvious disabilities and there are some that aren't, but you want to be sure that the accommodation that your child needs are being delivered in whatever environment they're in. And then Diane mentioned the procedural safeguards. You know, it's always best to try to resolve situations with the school, with a conversation. Look, you know, my child has this situation and needs this accommodation. You know, I understand that didn't happen in your classroom. Could you please review the 504 and make sure those accommodations are being delivered? You know, it's great to try to resolve things with the school one-on-one, but boy, if that's not working, you know, you have a right to file a complaint when things aren't being followed. So the link was on there, and here are the links for both the Pennsylvania Department of Ed and the Office of Civil Rights. So again, these are live. You'll be able to go there if you feel that's necessary or to learn more. And then there are, again, some of those red flag statements which should cause you to be cautious. If they do this in the 504, you know, we do it this way for every student. Well, your student isn't every student. Your student is one person, one unique individual. So ask questions, and you know, I'm sorry, this is my child has some unique needs, and this is the way his or her or their disability evidences itself. So we need to do it this way for my child. There are sometimes things we hear this maybe most often for IEPs. We don't offer IEPs in high school. Well, the same thing could be said for 504s. And understand what we've talked about today is 504s for school age students. This is something that could certainly continue at the college level, and IEPs will end when the student is out of high school. So you'll only be able to access a 504 plan in a college or higher ed environment or trade school. So understand that, but you know, don't accept that they won't offer an IEP or a 504 while the student is in there. If those accommodations or that specially designed instruction is needed, they still have an obligation to provide those things. And then exceptions, that's what these are all about. Making accommodations so your child has access to the curriculum like any other student. And then sometimes they, you know, try to mention diagnoses. Only the child with epilepsy or asthma gets a 504 plan. Well, we've just told you that's not true. So I'm afraid you're mistaken, and you know, press that issue. You don't have to accept that. And then, you know, sometimes it seems like the child who doesn't qualify for an IEP is offered a 504 almost as if it's a consolation prize. Well, you don't qualify for this, but we could give you this. You know, this little, like, you don't get this big bear at the fair, but you can have this little rubber duck. You know, so that's not what it is. It's it shouldn't be treated that way. Sometimes, you know, we suggest that families get a 504 in place while they're waiting for the IEP to be established, because some of those accommodations being in place can be really helpful and powerful while that IEP gets developed. But one is one is not something that's offered simply because you don't get the IEP. If you're eligible, you're eligible.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that our director of training, Susan Kilmeyer, has been putting in all of these links in the chat. So hopefully you're following and you're able to access those. But there was a question about, is a 504 most useful with a college student with a disability? Now, what I will tell you is you don't get an IEP in college, so you're done. You know, the IEP is only for school age. Okay, so once you're in college, so 504 is really all you have, because it is, you know, the Rehabilitation Act, and so this colleges can provide accommodation. So that was a really good question, and yeah, thank you for that.
And some comments about COVID too, Diane.
Yeah.
Remember, none of this stuff changed because of COVID. It didn't change because your student was in a remote instruction environment. It didn't change because they were in and out of school. They're still responsible to fulfill the accommodations of the 504 and or the IEP. None of this changed as a consequence. So we've kind of rolled to the end of our presentation this afternoon, but as Diane mentioned, we get federal funding for the work that we do. So if you could fill out this evaluation for us, we have a wonderful QR code here that you can simply scan. So if you pull up your camera, and if you point your camera at that circle on the screen in front of you, and then tap that screen to open the page, it will take you right there, and we'll put that in the chat for you as well, the link, if you're having any trouble with that. But if you could help us, we'd love your feedback, any suggestions or recommendations as to how we can improve this. We're always happy to learn and grow to better meet your needs.
And I just wanted to add that speaking of COVID, we are having a webinar coming up on August 19th, specific to COVID compensatory services, and it's a training. So it is on our website. You want to be sure to go to PEAL's website and check that out, and make sure you're registered for that. I think we might be sliding into a question and discussion time period. So our recording will probably be stopping any second, but I am going to give you some resources in a few minutes as well. But there is a question about an age limit for a 504 plan. To the best of my knowledge, Mary, I don't believe there is an age limit. Kelly, I don't know if you know specifically, but 504, it's the Rehabilitation Act. So there is no age limit to the best of my knowledge. Yeah, okay. So we have our questions, but I do want to show that when you do get the PowerPoint, all of these links will be live for you on the PowerPoint. So please feel free to, utilize these resources, maybe reconfirm things that we've gone through. I know maybe we had to go through a couple slides a little bit more quickly than usual. So hopefully all those resources will be helpful, as well as the PEAL Center. Our website has a wealth of information, and we do a whole host of other things. We have archived webinars on our website and everything as well. Kelly and I will be putting in our emails as well in the chat. So I think if we stop the recording now, we probably can go to answer. I know we reached our limit at 1. If you do need to leave,